start off with a question for each of our speakers and ask them to respond to that question, and after that we'll open it up to the audience itself. So first I'd like to pose a question to Jamin Humer, our last speaker. There's an interesting way of thinking about the issue of compulsion, and he's given a very persuasive argument about problems of compulsion when it comes to taxes. But I have a couple of questions thinking about the nature of the New Testament and conceptions of taxes, and also issues of what compulsion might be, and I hope you can answer these in more detail.
Okay.
So in Matthew, one of the things that was in the text is Jesus noted that one should not store up one's treasures on earth. And in Matthew, also discussing the Pharisees, is to give to Caesar what is Caesar and give to God what is God's. And in Paul discussed the importance of paying taxes. So partly it looks as though there might be an important recognition on the part of early Christians as the role of the state in paying taxes and what taxes can do for the poor. The second part of the question that I'm hoping that you can answer for us is much of the libertarian argument against positive duties is a concern about compulsion or compelling one to do an action such that it would no longer be free but is forced. So I'll give you an example, and I'm hoping you can explain why this is not a case of compulsion from the religious standpoint. So years ago, my mother was looking for a new church when she moved to a town. She ultimately decided not to go to this church, and here's the reason why. When it came time for the offering, rather than simply passing the basket around, as many churches do, everyone in the church stood up, everyone filed up to the front, person by person, and watched as everyone individually put money in. And she found that very uncomfortable and problematic. So if you could explain why that would not be a case of problematic, compelling action, and then also explain how to address the textual claims in the early Christian documents in the New Testament.
Excellent questions, and very common questions. The first one, I just wrote a two-part blog series on taxation in the first century and in the New Testament world, interacting with a Cato Institute fellow, and it's difficult to really give a satisfying answer without entering into the world of the New Testament, which involves a lot of aspects. Revolution is one of them, a big one. Violence, attempted coups and assassinations, and various rebel movements by especially the Jews, because their land was taken away. They're living under the Roman Empire, and the Romans would frequently suppress these rebellions. And it's this background of violence and a government that is really, well, this is on the coins, and Caesar was Lord. That phrase I said in my presentation was what people came to know. That's why the claim that Jesus is Lord was so revolutionary. But what was even more revolutionary was that Jesus didn't come with an army or on a horse with a sword and wanting to just overthrow things, as a lot of the Jews thought would happen. Not the political leader they quite intended. It's donkey and doing weird stuff and hanging out with tax collectors and prostitutes. Not quite what they had in mind. That was so there's some cultural dissonance there, and so the big concern that the early church had was, how do we survive? Jesus just got killed. He was resurrected, and so the big concern, with that background in mind, is we read Romans 13 and other places realizing, so this is not this blind obedience to governing authorities and people with crowns on their head. Jesus already made a mockery of that with his own crucifixion, wearing the crown of thorns and conquering the grave and everything else. There's a number of interesting it's a whole field of study now called empire criticism. Because in the letters, they couldn't openly criticize the empire and the state without potentially getting killed. So there's a field in New Testament studies that says, oh, well, look at how the first section of Romans 1 is like directed at Caesar in a way. It's like playing off of these different themes. So context is super important when pulling out verses like that. What's interesting about the two places where Jesus addresses taxes is he leaves the matter open. He doesn't close it. He doesn't simply say, the government has a rightful claim over your property. Give it to them. That's what's interesting. He doesn't say, give to Caesar what is yours. He doesn't acknowledge that. He's doing 5 or 6 different things in this phrase. That's why it's baffled scholars for centuries. And it was always a matter of controversy, and that's why it came up. I mean, apparently Jesus was saying things that would cause Christians to not pay their taxes. That's why it came up. And of course, the larger scheme is that what's really going on is the church is saying, the government doesn't just, like empire, the emperor is not God. He's not a divine figure. And the true Lord of the universe is in the form of Jesus Christ. And so there's so much literature on this. The other text by Jesus was he's sort of rolling his eyes like, okay, go into the river and you'll find this fish and you'll pay the denarii for the temple tax. In his words, so they wouldn't be offended. So that we might not offend them. The reason I pay taxes is because for the reason everybody else does. We don't want to go to prison. It's not because we believe that this money is actually going to be used in a useful purpose. There's no indication whatsoever.
I do. I'm thankful for every road, post office, public education. When it's time for me to pay my taxes, I do so thankfully.
Okay.
It wasn't time for questions.
At any rate, I don't. And I think all the goods and services offered by the government are non-proprietary, and the private sector could do 10 times as better for, especially roads and everything else. But anyway, so in answer to your first question, there's a lot more going on in the New Testament world with regard to obedience to authorities and the reason why the early church did. And this really came crashing down in the 20th century with German Nazism. And because for a long time, Christians had said, yes, obey the state, obey the state, obey the state. Oh my goodness, Adolf Hitler. Obey the... Then the question started being asked a little bit more. That's a kind of a scatterbrain answer to the first one. The second question, I'm sorry that was it your mother? I'm sorry that you went to that type of church that made that type of public expectation. I would never encourage that type of environment or practice. As I read in Corinthians, not under compulsion, I think that says we should give out of our hearts, which if our hearts are in the right place, that's going to be a lot, and it's going to be painful. So I'm not going to even remotely try to legitimize that type of practice.
So moving on to the question for our first speaker, Dr. Bailey. So I'll just keep this one very, very short. You spoke quite at length about the role of tax codes in creating income disparity, and there's a lot of private welfare that's done in terms of the Mormon Church and also Catholic charities. Could you say a little bit more as to whether or not you think that we should have both public and private responses to inequity, or are you endorsing a purely public and state-based approach to responding to inequity?
No, I'll stick to the second. I think that there's a problem with scale that certain sorts of problems can only be handled, at some larger government level. But not to plug my book, but in my book, one of the things that I see, one of the things that if you look at what tax deductions do, they do several things. They give you some incentive to save, right? Some incentive to invest. So they sort of encourage that sort of activity. And usually or not always, but oftentimes there's some sort of mechanism to facilitate people doing that. One of those mechanisms is just your taxes at the end of the year. But another one is, since we're at a university, some of you may be familiar with 401ks, and this is a relatively frictionless, easy way to invest in your retirement, right? So I don't know what it's like here, but at Duquesne, the first place I went when I got hired was to go to the benefits office, and they're like, oh, we have all these plans, and speaking of compulsion, they said, and you have to contribute this amount, right? It's a condition of working there. But so incentives and structure are like really important to being able to save. So to get to your question, there are a number of private foundations who have very deliberately and intentionally set up what are called individual development accounts for people of low income. And those foundations themselves match people's savings. So you put in $1, we'll put in $1. It depends upon the foundation. Sometimes the match is 10 to 1, so you put in $1, we'll put in $10. And so they do the work of helping to set up these accounts. They provide that sort of structure. Many poor people don't have access to banks. It's sometimes too expensive for them to do that. And then they provide the incentive. If you do deposit some money, we will match what you deposit, right? And they studied this then, and it turns out that those at lower incomes, when provided this sort of structure and incentive, actually save at rates higher than most American percentage of their income rates higher than most Americans. So, and I think that's been really helpful and useful, to sort of test out, does this theory work out? And so, yeah. But no foundation could scale that, to a kind of nationwide, yeah.
Good. We're going to open it up for questions from the audience. Students first in particular. Yes, please.
Dr. Bailey,
Yes.
how would you respond to someone who says that the role of the government as outlined in the Bible does not cover redistribution of wealth?
Well, I'm a Catholic, so I can like, what's the Bible? But, I mean, I guess I would have to hear that argument. I don't know what the argument is. Yeah.
And so, like going to Acts and talking about the early church and how they're sharing their wealth amongst each other, saying that that's like voluntary giving.
Yeah.
And when Paul talks about government, role of government in other places and other people write about it in the New Testament, when they don't outline, they outline, rewarding good, punishing evil, but they don't outline anything about redistribution of wealth. How would you respond to saying that you see that these government policies are necessary?
Well, I think I respond in part by saying, Christianity is a tradition, and part of its tradition are scriptures, but part of its tradition is its tradition. So there are all sorts of early church folks who really, stress, helping those who are poor, put pressure on those who are wealthy to do so, right? And there's also a very long tradition of the important role that government plays in people's lives, and part of that role is funding necessary activity. So I would, I suppose, in typical Catholic fashion, put the Bible alongside a number of other sources and draw some conclusions from that.
Dr. Bailey, you said something about meritocratic distributions of wealth in capitalist societies, like how you think that that might be problematic. Or I don't know, I think you said that it might be problematic, or you had something to say about it. But what I wonder is there, or might there be a problem, not with the distribution per se, but with placing like money as a primary good in our markets, like saying that we have to be able to access other goods via money.
Say more about what you see as the problem of that.
The major problem being that, like, if I want to access like maybe better education for a child, I have to use money in that case, or like access to food. I'm using money like in the sense of like distributing, or like trying to make social arrangements more equal. Why is it that the primacy has to be on money as the ultimate good that we are able to access other goods through? Is that the problem itself, or like?
Okay, so if we take education as an example, so what you're saying is you shouldn't have to borrow student loans, or B, your parents have a lot of cash in the bank, to go to college. You should just be able to go to college.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. I think it's going to use a word you're going to love. I think socializing the expense of college is something, it is a good idea. Now, it costs money, right? But so a lot of it is, so it has to be paid for in some way. But I think it makes sense to at least think about, the idea that college students today wouldn't have to take out enormous loans, or have very wealthy parents, or be star football players to go to college. But we could pay for that college through taxes, another word you're going to like, and all of us would recognize that we would have to pay those taxes. Once we graduate from college, we will have to pay the taxes for this particular benefit. So it's not like it's free to you. You're going to pay for somebody else's education through your whole life, but it doesn't place all of the burden on students to finance, when they're 18 to 22, their entire education, and then have to pay that very large sum of money back, in their 20s and 30s and 40s. I think that's not a workable solution to me. Yeah.
Okay, two students here in the front row. I think your hand was first.
Dr. Bailey, how do you respond to the government inefficiencies that are caused when redistribution occurs?
Yeah. I respond by saying we should make them more efficient. So it's interesting. I think part of the inefficiency actually comes through trying to be too precise about who qualifies for this benefit. So, and that leads to people having to go to an office and fill out forms, and then somebody has to make a judgment about whether or not they actually qualify, and so on. One thing that the government does very efficiently is transfer money. Think back to the recession of 2008. We were in a situation in which the whole banking system was about to collapse, and they needed to just flood the banking system with cash, and they did that overnight. Like that was efficient. And so transfers of money, and you're starting to hear like discussions of universal income and these sorts of things, but the inefficiencies are real, and some so we could do a better job of figuring out when it really matters that we have to get so involved in who's getting the benefit. But sometimes that's just a cost you have to pay, right?
Dr. Hubner, given the vast discrepancies in wealth inequality, particularly along racial lines, how do you justify your polemic against paying taxes and income distribution as anything more than an attempt to, I guess, normalize a system that privileges a few over the many, namely the few being elite white males, over everyone else? And how do you justify legitimizing that by a religious tradition, especially?
Well, start out with some knowns. Racism is terrible, and I guess I have not looked, I haven't even thought about how the certain current tax system might privilege certain races. I had never even thought of that. Maybe that's occurring, maybe it's not, I don't know. But if taxes were abolished for everybody, I guess you wouldn't even have the opportunity for privilege, would you? It's very interesting about the nature of the state. We're all convinced income tax is just like absolutely necessary. Nobody paid income tax prior to 1913. There was roads, there were schools, there were fire trucks, there was everything virtually that we attribute to the government. It's a very late invention. It was a temporary tax to fund World War I. Any of you pay income tax? Temporary tax to fund a war that finished almost a century ago. It's utterly unnecessary, and if you think it is necessary, I mean, it's unfortunate that people have already died and have lived for hundreds of years that never paid it. And you can talk to them and see how necessary it is. But the state is the only social entity that makes offers that, if refused, will result in violence. If I go to McDonald's and they say, we'll give you a burger for $2, and I say, no, I don't want to pay $2 for a burger. I walk out, no problem. Go to Toyota, I want to buy a SUV for $35,000. They say, no, you got to pay $50,000. I decline. I walk away, no problem. The government says, we'll give you these services, A, B, C, and D, for two-fifths of your income, and a slew of regulations. I decline. You go to prison. That's very interesting, and how we've come to just accept this systematic violence, like that it's necessary. It's not, and in fact, my wife Jessica, she likes to swim, and we live in Rapid City, and there's a quote-unquote public pool that she goes to, but she has to pay membership. Why? Well, because there's probably not enough cash from the pool of reserves for whatever, so they have to charge more. So they say, well, we shouldn't charge everybody. We can't just increase taxes for everybody for the people who want to go to the pool, so we're just going to charge the people who want to go to the pool. Genius idea. Why isn't that consistently upheld? That's the way the rest of society works. Voluntary transactions. So, the American tax system is extremely complicated, and I wouldn't even begin to try and unfold how it's fair or unfair for certain people, or whatever. And it is disturbing that there is these racial inequalities. If we think that the government is going to be able to solve racism, well, we've had a black president for 8 years. I guess I haven't seen much improvement of racial issues. So
we're over time, but our speakers have agreed to stay later and address any additional questions that you have. Dr. Manson's being very persistent. All right, there's one more student in the back. All right.
You said, said about the fact that the government has a scale enough to handle these problems, and the private sector might not, at least at first.
A scale also to create some of the greatest woes, such as the Great Depression and the recession of 2008. The government's fully responsible for that. It mandated subprime mortgages. The Fed artificially lowered interest rates 5 years prior, creating a housing bubble, which then was pricked when the Fed rose rates. Fully responsible. Same for the Great Depression. It's great. There's a cyclical recession in 1920 and 21, and about a year later, everything was fine. Happened again in 1929, and it turned into an 8-year nightmare because the government threw everything, the kitchen sink. I mean, all the bureaus, agencies, everything the government could possibly do. And of course, that created what a recession became a depression. Now, something my partner mentioned regarding, the government's really efficient at transferring money, into corporations' pockets and into their own pockets and into the pockets of central bankers. Where did the money come from that was printed in 2008? Or excuse me, I gave you the answer. It was printed. Printed. And what happens when you print trillions and trillions of dollars? Inflation. Who does that hurt most? The poor. They go to the grocery store, they can't get a gallon of milk for $2 anymore. They have to pay $3. 3 years later, they have to pay $4. 3 years later, they have to pay $5, $6, $7, until eventually the currency becomes worthless, as it did over 50 times in the 20th century. Multiple times with the ruble, multiple times in several countries. Look at Zimbabwe, look at the German mark. I mean, you want to talk about what hurts the poor. There's nothing that hurts the poor most directly than central banking and fiat currency. Because it's completely backed by the government. There's nothing the poor can do. So, the scale of the government, I guess it can, I mean, the U.S. government can destroy a lot of countries really efficiently, with drones and in Air Force. It can do a remarkable amount of destruction. I wish it could be a force for good. That'd be great, but the historical record says something else.
We're way over time, so please join me in thanking our two speakers.